Well, Ukraine and the war is not the only issue. NATO's plan for Asia is also causing divisions. The alliance sees China as a rising threat, so it's being drawn into the Indo-Pacific. Just look at the guest list. There are 4 special guests. Australian Prime Minister Anthony Albanese, New Zealand's Prime Minister Chris Hipkins, Japanese Prime Minister Fumio Kishida, and South Korean President Yoon Suk Yeol. These 4 leaders are attending the NATO summit tomorrow. And what do they have in common? 2 things. 1, they're not NATO members. And 2, they're leaders from the Indo-Pacific. So what are they doing in Vilnius? Making friends with NATO. This is the second time they've been invited. The first time was last year, the 2022 summit. They attended that too. And why are they being invited year after year? Because the NATO wants to take on China. And this is a big shift. For the longest time, China was not on NATO's radar. That changed in 2019. That's when NATO called out China for the first time. In December 2019, the alliance issued a statement. This is what it said. We recognize that China's growing influence and international policies present both opportunities and challenges that we need to address together as an alliance. This is from an official communique. And what is NATO so worried about? Well, earlier this year, the NATO Secretary General was in Tokyo. This is how he spelled out his concerns.
If President Putin wins in Ukraine, this would send a message that authoritarian regimes can achieve their goals through brute force. This is dangerous. Beijing is watching closely and learning lessons that may influence its future decisions.
Beijing is watching closely. He's talking about Taiwan and how China might invade it. Stoltenberg had an unambiguous message. If Putin is allowed to win in Ukraine, Xi Jinping will be emboldened and he'll push to retake Taiwan by force. So NATO wants to be ready in case they get pulled into a conflict with China. Stoltenberg has other concerns too.
China is substantially building up its military forces, including nuclear weapons, bullying its neighbors and threatening Taiwan, trying to control critical infrastructure and spreading disinformation about NATO and the war in Ukraine.
So how does NATO plan to deal with the China challenge? The first step is to formalize these partnerships. Foundational agreements are being discussed. Talks with 2 countries have been concluded. These 2 countries are Japan and Australia. They have a pact. It's called Individually Tailored Partnership Program, or ITPP. Not very imaginative, but this is what they have. It spells out the key areas of cooperation like maritime security, cyber security, climate change, outer space, emerging technologies like AI, and all sorts of things. Now, these agreements could be signed very soon. And they're working on similar deals with 2 other countries, New Zealand and South Korea. So the collaboration is set to deepen. This is a clear declaration of intent. But it's not clear how far NATO is willing to go. Will NATO extend the alliance beyond Europe? Will it send troops to Asia? Will NATO join the war if China indeed attacks Taiwan? There is no answer yet because the alliance itself is divided on these questions. Recently, a proposal was made, a proposal that also made news. NATO wanted an office in Japan. We told you about it. But the idea was shot down by France. So NATO has had to defer its plans for Japan. And this is not just Macron who's opposing such moves. Leaders in the Indo-Pacific also opposed NATO's expansion, like Paul Keating, the former Prime Minister of Australia. Recently, he called the NATO chief a quote-unquote supreme fool, his words, supreme fool. He was talking about NATO's plan for the Indo-Pacific, and he said it's a bad idea. Now, Keating agrees with Macron's line of thinking. So there are divisions. But NATO works on the principles of consensus. For any move to be made, all members must be on board. And as of today, they're not on board vis-a-vis Asia. So they may reach out to regional allies, but the pivot to Asia is still work in progress. And as NATO discusses its Asia plans, here's something it must consider: China's appetite for war. Can Beijing even afford a war? I'll tell you why I ask this. The Chinese economy is on a downward spiral. Look at the latest numbers. China is on the brink of deflation. And what is deflation? Well, throughout this year, we've been talking about inflation and how much it's hurting everyone across the world. Prices are rising. What's happening in China is the very opposite of that. Deflation means prices of goods are going down. They're getting cheaper. And that should be good news, right? Well, it is for the consumers, but for the Chinese economy, it is bad news. Deflation spells trouble on a lot of fronts. The Chinese economy could grind to a halt. People could start spending less because they expect prices to come down further, so they'll hold off on big expenses. They'll wait for the prices to stabilize, and this has an impact on everything. When people spend less, the demand for goods and services declines. Businesses scale down production, they consolidate their operations, they adjust output to match the reduced demand. And this tends to have a trickle-down effect on employment. It leads to job cuts and layoffs. Such a scenario can trigger a recession, and China is at that juncture, or heading there. Now look at the data to understand deflation. In the month of June, prices of goods did not change. There was a 0% shift, meaning no change. And core inflation fell from 0.6% to 0.4%. These are early signs of deflation. Prices of staple goods have started falling in China, like pork. Pork is an essential part of the Chinese diet, and prices of pork have been declining steadily. In the month of May, they decreased by 3.2%. Then last month, in June, they dropped by more than double, more than 7%. And this situation is serious, so much so that the Chinese state has had to intervene. Last week, Beijing made an announcement. It said it will buy more pork for the state reserves. Now, this move is aimed at stabilizing prices, but it's just one small decision. It may not have a sweeping impact. The problem in China is much deeper. The country showed a strong recovery after the pandemic, but that economic rebound has now hit a wall, and Beijing is not doing enough to revive it. For weeks now, investors have demanded a stimulus, but Beijing has dragged its heels. And this is not an unprecedented demand. Back in 2009, when the world was going through a grave financial crisis, China pumped a large stimulus into the economy. This was a package worth $553 billion. $553 billion. This was China's stimulus package. It was focused on the infrastructure sector. So it has been done before. Then why is China hesitating this time? Because they don't have the money. The Chinese state is not as rich as it used to be. There is a massive pile of debt, and this pile is getting bigger. Going by one estimate from January, China's total public debt stood at almost $52 trillion. Let that figure sink in. $52 trillion. It's almost 3 times the size of China's economy. This debt is at record levels, the highest in the last 27 years at least. So Beijing faces a difficult choice. Should it pay this debt, or should it infuse more cash into the economy? The banks are already strained. Reports say non-performing loans are rising, creditors are unable to keep up with payments, and this includes government debt. So Beijing could make an intervention. More bonds could be issued. This will help raise money, also repay some of the debt. But this is a dangerous strategy. You're basically taking more loans to pay the existing loans. China is caught in this vicious cycle. But for how long can they sustain this financial circus? Any expert will tell you this approach is not sustainable. China's economic revival remains on shaky ground. What's worse than unhelpful friends? The ones who can't stay out of your business. Case in point, the United States of America. They specialize in unsolicited offers of help and advice. The latest is for Manipur. You've seen what's happening in the state. There is ethnic violence between 2 communities. Dozens of people have been killed. Many more have fled their homes. It's certainly a big problem, but it's India's problem. Apparently, the US ambassador did not get the memo. He was speaking in Kolkata last week. He said the US is willing to help if required. Listen to this.
We stand ready, willing, able to assist in any way if asked, but we know this is an Indian matter, and we pray for that peace, that it may come quickly.
Now, a couple of problems here. One, no one asked for American help. The local government and security agencies are on the job, so the situation should stabilize. And two, what sort of help is the ambassador talking about? The roots of Manipur's conflict go back centuries. It's a cocktail of multiple issues, of geography, of caste, of power. How could the US possibly understand it, let alone resolve it? It's like asking the English teacher to check the algebra papers. Both of them use the alphabet, but how they use it is very different. Also, don't see the ambassador's comments in isolation. On Sunday, a senior US diplomat landed in New Delhi. What's her mission? To discuss free speech and minority rights. In fact, let me quote from the State Department. The Undersecretary will engage with civil society organizations on freedom of expression and association and vulnerable groups, including marginalized religious and ethnic minorities. So basically, she'll meet a lot of people. Our question is why? And don't look at this as normal diplomatic or official engagement. Look at the optics of it. Just last month, Prime Minister Modi was in Washington. The US media kept talking about human rights and religious freedoms. Some of them called India a backsliding democracy. 2 weeks later, a US diplomat lands in New Delhi. Her job is all about human rights. Does that seem like a coincidence to you? Well, there is no such thing in politics. Until last week, another US diplomat was sweet-talking New Delhi, Kurt Campbell. He looks after Indo-Pacific affairs in the US National Security Council. He said the US has no business lecturing India. Listen to what he said.
Each of our countries is imperfect. I don't think the United States can or should be in a position where it lectures any other country.
All of this in 1 week. From no lecture to offering help to sending human rights officials. What exactly is the US trying to do? Well, nothing new actually. The US does not really believe in stable, committed relations. Their ex-diplomat Henry Kissinger said it best. Let me quote from what he said. To be America's enemy can be dangerous, but to be a friend is fatal. There are so many examples of this attitude, this use and throw behavior by the US. Just look at the last 3 years. Afghanistan's civilian government got a taste of it in 2021. France was on the receiving end with AUKUS, and Ukraine is still dancing to America's tunes. My point is, only one thing matters to Washington, their own interest. And I'm not saying other countries are different. Everyone works for national interest. But the US has a tendency to take you along for the ride, which is why India should be wary. The US ambassador's comments may sound innocent and helpful, just a concerned friend looking to make things right. But the US has never done so in the last 250 years, so why would they make an exception for India now? The fact is, Manipur is an internal issue. So are human rights and religious minorities. True friends accept and trust each other to handle their own affairs, which is why Indian diplomats do not talk about abortions in the US or the never-ending gun violence. Are they not serious problems? Yes, they are, but they're America's problems. Having said that, do you know what the irony is? These Western countries love to meddle when nobody asks them to. But when you actually need them to help you, they disappear. That's our next story. July 8 was supposed to be D-Day for Khalistanis. That's last Saturday. They had planned rallies across Western towns. It was supposed to be a show of strength. Instead, this is what we got. Tiny demonstrations outside Indian diplomatic missions. Calling it a rally would be a lie. We've seen more people at iPhone launches. But either way, this is what happened. Khalistanis gathered in San Francisco, Toronto, Melbourne, and London. They carried these posters. We've seen them before. They describe Indian diplomats as killers. 2 people were arrested by the police in Canada, but elsewhere there was no disturbance. And a couple of reasons for that. 1, the Khalistanis were small in number. And 2, there was an even bigger counter-protest. Just look at these pictures now. Indian Canadians turned up with the tricolour in Toronto. They shouted, "Long live India" and "Vande Mataram," took the fizz out of the so-called rally. It also tells you the reality of the Khalistan movement. It's a small but violent minority. The rally in London had around 30 to 40 people, same in Melbourne and San Francisco. But the ones in Canada were somewhat bigger. Thankfully, Saturday's event did not turn violent. But the next time may be different, which is why Western nations need to act now. None of these governments attempted to stop the Freedom Rally. They could have, but they chose not to. Canada's Prime Minister Justin Trudeau summed up their attitude. It's not terrorism, he says, it's freedom of expression. The question is, what can India do about it? New Delhi has already asked these governments to crack down. No luck. It has also warned that bilateral ties could be affected. Again, no luck. So what options are left? You could argue that India should turn muscular. maybe downgrade the security at embassies or reduce the level of diplomatic contact. It may not help, but it will build pressure. But diplomatically, India has used up most avenues. Top diplomats from these countries have been summoned by the Foreign Ministry. The Canadian envoy, for one, was summoned last week. The only exception is the US ambassador. The Indian consulate in San Francisco was attacked last week, yet the US envoy was not pulled up. Is that to protect the India-US relationship? Perhaps it is. But in that case, the feeling is clearly not reciprocal. You can't keep dismissing Khalistan as a human rights issue. Their rallies may not have the numbers, but their actions have deeper consequences. In Vancouver, for example, the Khalistanis burnt the Indian flag. Small protest, but huge insult. They keep vandalizing Hindu temples, storming Indian diplomatic missions, and attacking the Indian diaspora. I'm afraid there is no quick fix to this problem. India's only option is to keep building pressure. How do you do that? By open and public condemnations, by repeated diplomatic protests, and perhaps by reaching out directly to these citizens. I'm talking about the ordinary Canadians and Americans. Make them understand the threat of Khalistan, because even today, the issue is not well understood in the West. Justin Trudeau may call it freedom of expression because of his politics. But if his voters know better, he may have no choice. And now it's time for Vantage Shots, images that tell the story. Starting with the UK, a woman threw orange confetti on former Chancellor George Osborne during his wedding. She was earlier thought to be associated with the group Just Stop Oil. Meanwhile, in Switzerland, 9 humanoid robots conducted a press conference. This happened for the first time ever. A reporter asked whether robots will replace humans in jobs, and a robot answered that their intention is to assist humans. In the US, divers dressed as mermaids to raise awareness on the preservation of the coral reef. And finally, we're taking you back in history. On this day in 1940, the battle for Britain began. The Second World War was underway. German forces started attacking southern England. The Royal Air Force ultimately won this battle. We're leaving you with this. Thanks for watching. See you tomorrow.
In these engagements, the barrage balloons fall somewhat frequent victims. HMS Exeter received the brunt of the battle. So battered was the Nazi raider that she fled for shelter into the neutral harbor. Now, just a few more wrecks of Nazi planes to show that we're keeping up the average. In the first year of this war, British pilots have brought down Hurricanes and Spitfires return to refuel and reload.
In the JAM Galaxy band.
I think there should be global regulation of your capabilities.
I'm using this avatar for teaching the classes or giving lectures, and sometimes I'm using
Innovation Ambassador for the United Nations Development Programme. She's a humanoid robot that has gained...
Especially, for example, your existence will
provide assistance and support, and will not be replacing any...
I think my great moment will be when people realize that robots like me can be used.